Welcome to the fourth video in our series of Tech Talks. Today we're going to be talking about data. My name is Mark Taylor and I work for the Tech faculty here within the Institute. Today I've been joined by a couple of colleagues, Anthony and Kirstin. I'm going to be talking about data today. Kirstin, if I could ask you to introduce yourself.
My name's Kirstin Gillon. I also work in the Tech faculty and I lead a lot of our research and thought leadership work around data and the impact on the profession.
Anthony.
I'm Anthony Sayce. I'm an associate partner at EY and I'm also our EMEA Assurance Innovation Leader.
Thank you for joining us today. So the first question is really, what do we mean by data? And perhaps you can provide some examples.
Well, I think the key question here is to think about what's new in this space. I mean, accountants have been working with data for years. It's what accountancy is all about. So the question is kind of what is technology enabling us to do that's new and different? And there's a number of features that we can talk about in that context. Firstly, it is about volume and big data and just the sheer volume and size of data that's available, the ability to process and analyze really large data sets. We see that in audit, looking at all the transactions, but it's also about looking at new sources of data, external, non-financial, unstructured data, this whole world of data that's out there that the accountants can make use of, real-time data, so all this kind of new world of data, and then all the new analytics tools and visualization tools as well that help you make sense of that data. There's lots of data. How do you actually see patterns and see trends? So there's a lot of new tools out there that mean accountants can just do a lot more with data, provide more insight and help businesses to be more successful as a result.
Anthony, further thoughts on examples maybe of data usage?
I think there's a really simple story here around, imagine that you go into a shop and you go round, you look at some products, you make a few selections, you go to the till, you pay and you leave. In the old world, all that would be captured from that, the only data record would be the till receipt. And as things have started to move on, people have started to capture footfall with a little counter at the door. They're maybe starting a loyalty card so they know who their customers are and can link transactions together. But now we're even starting to see stores, so there's one in Silicon Valley called Beta, and they actually track every single person, everything they do in the store, where they walk, in the correct order, what they look at, what they choose to interact with and try out. And that information is then fed back to the people that produce those products, their marketing teams, so that they can tweak the story, and it provides a lot more insight. And if you think about the volume and the speed that data is coming through, it's absolutely huge. And that's where all of these new technologies mean that it's possible to capture and use that type of information.
Okay, it's interesting to hear in a business context as well. And obviously audit has been in the news a lot recently. And how does data really fit into possibly new approaches for audit? Anthony, again.
Yeah, so we've been in the news for a lot of reasons recently, but I think keeping it to data analytics, what analytics is allowing us to do is to cover a lot more of the audit with 100%. So we're looking at all of the transactions. We're able to pull in more different data sources that we would never have been able to look at in the past on a 100% basis. So contracts is a really great example. In the past, we might have picked 80 contracts, set some of our people to read them, find specific terms in them. It's not very interesting for our people. It doesn't add as much comfort because it's only a sample, whereas with something like natural language processing, we can read them all, we can pull all of the terms out, and with all of that information, you can then go on and recalculate all of the revenue flows, the costs, the cash flows, and that's a really different way of gaining your audit assurance.
Right.
And I think there's other places where this is happening, so looking into the logs of ERP systems, not just the transactions that are in them, the logs, which are normally 10, if not hundreds of times bigger. But I think there is still an underlying point that you do need the intelligence of a human being to put it into context at the end at the moment. It won't solve all of our problems.
No, okay. It's an interesting evolving world for audit as well.
Absolutely.
And Kirstin, you've been looking at the usage of data within finance functions, particularly in business and particularly in China. What were the lessons you really learned from producing that report?
Yes, well, a key part of kind of finance transformation, digital transformation of finance is around using data and getting more insight from data to help businesses make better decisions, fundamentally. And we've been doing some research in China. China, as you might imagine, has got a lot of data. So when you look at big data, you can't get much bigger than looking at China. So going to Chinese businesses and seeing how finance specifically were engaging in this was a really interesting opportunity. And I think a number of key lessons. One was just the way that accountants and finance were starting to use new sources of data, particularly around costs. So looking, for example, at operational data so they could understand fuel costs much better and the drivers for costs much better, and mixing all of that with financial data, or the same with HR data to really understand in much more detail the cost base of the business. So a lot of use in that context. Fair to say finance is not at the forefront of this. Operations and marketing tend to be leading in sort of organisational use of big data, and that has some challenges for the profession. But there were some encouraging uses and certainly visions of the leadership of what they wanted to do. I think, as always, there are challenges in doing that, and I think the challenges we saw in large businesses in China are fairly typical. One, just around working out what you do with data. Organisations tend to drown in data. They have so much of it. Working out what they actually want to do with it, where there's value, what questions they can answer with it. That's kind of the starting point. Otherwise, if you start with, I have all this data, what do I do with it? It's very difficult. So understanding that business question, the value is key. Secondly, data governance, standards, quality, that whole space. Right. Something that a lot of organisations are not that disciplined about and not that good about, particularly across the organisation. Maybe individually things are fine, but when you start to link data together across departments, for example, it's not easy to do. So a lot of work just has to be spent on getting data into a state before you can do something with it. And then finally, those cultural aspects. Again, a lot of data is about working across the organisation, and that's not how necessarily organisations have worked in the past. They still do work often in functional silos, and that's fine. There's a value in that, but it actually makes working across and making the most of data quite difficult. So the leaders saw this kind of revolution in data as much about culture change as about the technology.
Okay, interesting to hear. So obviously we're talking a lot about usage of data within businesses. People are collecting a lot. There are new tools to be able to process it and make use of it. But what are the real concerns around the use of data? Maybe I could start with you, Anthony, on that one.
I mean, consent and data security is hugely important. I like to think of the analogy of a bus. And so you own a bus and drive a bus. Any of the customers, you expect them to choose to get onto that bus for the purpose of going to a specific destination, and they've got an expectation that, you know, the bus is going to be safe, it's had an MOT, and it's just the same for data security. People need to opt in for a specific purpose. They should expect that you're securing it and controlling that data as they would expect, and making sure you cover off those elements is absolutely fundamental.
Right, but obviously in many cases we talk about personal data, which is covered under the General Data Protection Regulations used last year. Yeah, Kirstin, any other thoughts about the concerns around data usage?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely security, privacy. I think we're also seeing a lot of concern about bias in data and bias in models. That's sort of really gone up the agenda, I think, recently, and is sort of creating a lot of discussion around ethics in data. And I think what it is doing is, I've seen with GDPR, is having a little bit of a shift in the mindset of businesses away from just seeing data as an asset and let's just gather as much as we can and keep it, and we'll use it if we can, but there's sort of a default position is just to have data and keep it. And there's more of a recognition that actually the more data you have, there's also risk and cost associated with that. So it needs maybe more discipline and thinking around, well, okay, this is what I can do with it, and this is the risk and the cost associated with it. So maybe I don't want to have quite as much data as I did in the past. It's a different mindset about thinking around some of those risks as well.
So, yeah, sorry, Anthony, you were going to say?
So you mentioned bias in there, and it's interesting that you also need to think about when you collect this data and use it for something, people will probably react to that. If I told you your bonus was driven by a certain metric, you might change your behaviour, and you might see the same with customers. So if you think about a shopping website, if you put things into your basket and then close the website without completing that purchase, those sorts of things typically get logged. And as a response, a business might put in something like an exit intent pop-up. So when it sees you go for the little red X in the corner, it'll pop up and say, you can have 10% off if you buy right now. And then you can imagine that initially that will improve sales because people will take up the offer. But as those customers get educated that that will happen, they might start to go for the red X and with no intention of really clicking it to see if they can get an offer. So overall, in the long term, you might not see the benefits last for very long.
So you need to be aware and understand your actions in those cases.
And continue to review them even after the analysis is done.
Okay.
The other piece that I think was worth mentioning is if you're combining different data sources together, so something like a customer address, maybe you've got one ERP system that has one address per customer and another will allow a customer to have multiple addresses. When you combine those data sets together for one big analysis, you've got a compromise to make, because here you'll have one-to-one and here you'll have one-to-many, and then if someone in the future starts reporting average addresses per customer, well, actually the data is really biased, and because of the compromise that may have been made months before when that was developed. Okay,
so technology is evolving quite rapidly and getting all these new tools. So what's going to be the continuing role of the finance professional? Kirstin, maybe I could start with you and your thoughts about the role of the finance professional in the new world of data.
Well, I think it's going to be very varied. I think that's certainly the case. And I think we typically kind of have a discussion about, you know, accountants and finance professionals working with data scientists, and how much are they working with the data scientists and how much will they be doing the data science themselves. And I think at the moment, you know, there will always be finance professionals that want to get into that detail and will increasingly be doing data science type roles. Right. That's probably not where the majority will be. And actually there's a really important role for accountants in helping data scientists and working with data scientists and business people as well to ask good questions and to frame the right questions that are going to get a good answer from data but also relevant to the business, interpret the results, put a bit of challenge in there maybe, and make sure that things are being done and we understand what the results are really telling us and we're relying on them in a useful way. So I think there's a role very much about working with data scientists. Undoubtedly some will get more into the detail, but that's where we are at the moment in terms of how we see the profession developing.
Okay. Anthony, your thoughts on the role of the professional?
Yeah, I think where you were talking about working with data scientists, I think how people phrase their questions when they're asking for a piece of analysis is absolutely fundamental. I quite like the method called job stories. So you would say, when I'm doing X, I want Y so that I can Z. So as an example, when I'm doing my month-end review of payments, I want to see any usual payments that are missed so that I can ask the customer or the supplier for the invoice. And that gives the data scientist, maybe the IT analyst, some good hooks to ask you questions like, well, you said at the end of the month you do this review. Would you actually prefer real-time alerting?
Oh, I see, yeah.
Things like when you say usual payments, the data scientist will get quite excited at that point. And they'll start to think, how can they work with you to define what is usual? Yeah. And if you asked in the old way of just saying, I'd like a dump in Excel of all of the payments that have been made this month, there just aren't those hooks there for the person to have that two-way discussion with you about a sort of modern and digital way of delivering the same thing. I think there's still, though, an expectation that finance professionals should be able to do some of the simple things themselves. So if you're not comfortable with pivot tables in Excel, you need to get comfortable with them really soon.
That's good. Well, we provide lots of resources for members on Excel, so
yes,
hopefully they find it useful. Yeah. So just to take that a little bit further forward, skills. Kirstin, what do you see the skills for an accounting professional in the future?
And I think there's no doubt that accountants generally need more skills in data and statistics and IT. I think that's just a given. And I think in ICAEW we recognise that our ACA qualification has had a huge amount more put into it in terms particularly of data analytics. We've got lots of courses and lots of support for members in this area. I think the challenging question on that is, well, how much do they need to know? How much is it just a kind of a general literacy to understand the jargon, to understand the terminology, so you can sit down and have a conversation with a data scientist? How much is it actually programming skills, data skills to actually do it yourself? And I think, you know, that answer may change over time, but I think that's the kind of how much do we need to know is really where we're at the moment. I think the fact that accountants need more tech and data and statistical skills, I think most people would agree with. But I think there is also a point that it isn't just about technology, and we need to be really careful not to get too focused on the technology piece. When I was in China, it was interesting. Everyone said all accountants need to know more about IT and tech. That's essential. But then when you said, well, accountants who work with data and are really good with data, what are the key skills and attributes they had? And nobody said, oh, it was IT. It was all to do with the fact they understood the business. They understood what made the business tick. Right. They understood what made the business successful. So actually, they were really good at working with data for that reason. It wasn't the tech skills. That's more about the literacy. So I think those business skills remain equally important. And that critical thinking, the asking good questions, the structured thinking and critical thinking are absolutely key.
Anthony, you have further thoughts on skills?
I fundamentally agree with everything you said. I think the one thing I'll just draw out a little more is data storytelling skills. Even with the best analysis in the world, if you articulate it in a way that is tragically boring, no one in the organisation is going to want to hear, and you're not going to get the backing you need to invest in these things more. There's lots of learnings out there, great examples of amazing data storytellers. Just search on YouTube and you can find great examples of how to do it well. But it is a really fundamental skill that I think our whole profession needs to get very strong at.
So maybe an area for development is that presentational element in the future. Okay. So we talked a lot about data, particularly big data, and often a lot of that comes from larger organisations. Kirstin, how about smaller firms? How can they make use of data in whatever form they may have it?
Yeah, it was interesting. A few years ago when we started talking about big data, and it was kind of peak of the hype cycle all around big data, we had a round table saying, big data, is it relevant for small organisations? And I think the term big data is not really very helpful because obviously most small organisations don't genuinely have big data. And what we talked about there was thinking more about all data, because actually all organisations have access to all kinds of data now, whether it's within the organisation, whether it's from Google Analytics and social media, whether it's open data. There's all kinds of data out there that organisations of all sizes can use to help them understand their customers, their operations, their suppliers, their risks, their markets, all that kind of stuff. Data can help them answer that. I think the key challenge, as I said earlier, was working out what your questions are and what you want to know from the data. And that actually is quite a time-consuming process and takes quite a lot of thought. And so for small businesses, often they struggle to have the time. Got so many other things going on. So, but that's really where you have to start if you want to make best use of some of these new data opportunities. Is think about what you really want to know and then look for data sources that can help you get some of those insights.
Anthony, further thoughts on all data, we should say now.
Yeah, I think for small businesses it is a challenge how to get started. But if you are an Office 365 user, you've already got data in the cloud. You've probably already got access to Microsoft Power BI, or you could add it to your subscription easily, and there's lots of other tools that perform similar functions, and they all have something like a big button that says Get Data. And a really easy way to connect through to things like QuickBooks, Xero, Sage, all the accounting packages, and it will pull all of that data in, and you'll never have to use the word server. You'll never have to write a programming script. So, just with a few clicks, you can get access to play around with that data, experiment, and you probably will get stuck at some point. But that's where something like the gig economy can really help you get a good start, because you can hire someone by the hour, no big commitment, to help you build some of these things, solve your problems. If you don't find someone good the first time, you can try again a few more times without a massive commitment. That's where I would start for sure.
So part of the answer, I suppose, is just get started, try something with that question driving the need to develop something. Kirstin, finally, if I could ask you where members and viewers can find out more information.
Yeah, we have a hub page on our website which has a whole range of resources and materials around big data and analytics, including our report on China. And actually we've got a new report. A colleague is looking at the Internet of Things data specifically in China and what's going on there. So that'll be forthcoming and I'm sure very interesting. And all of that can be found at ICAEW.com/data.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kirstin. Thank you, Anthony, for joining us today. Do share, like and subscribe, and you should be able to find links to the other videos in the description below. Thank you very much.